MK team. We were gonna have some chip today, but that's not happening. Probably not soon, if at all. I'm tired, okay? However, we will be going over the same sorts of things we covered the last couple of weeks. Feel free to stop in and get some matchup practice and some analysis if you are interested in my analysis. This is a loser stays on lobby, so you get to keep your practice up and get as much matchup practice as possible. You don't have to hope that you manage to fight the person that you think you can't beat. Once they rotate around, you'll probably get your chance again. Information on how to join the lounge is in the tweet that we sent out and probably in the stream title. Note that this is a US East Coast lobby, but we didn't actually put any restriction on whether or not you can join. Please try not to join the lounge if you live too far away. But feel free to come in and see what the connection says. There's always something, and we don't really mind playing up to 7-8 frames lag, as long as it's about figuring out matchup stuff. We don't care so much about the high execution just yet. Since we're seeing mostly the same characters this week, if no one in particular joins to play anyone specifically new, you're not going to get too much from me this time. Just the team getting their general practice in and me reminding them of all the stuff they need to remember when I am spotting for them. We've been making good progress in terms of feeling more comfortable in the game as a generality. So you're likely to see a lot more measured play than before, and less repetition, I guess you'd say. You know what I'm talking about. Repeat something until you are sure you can handle it. But we're probably going to see more flashy stuff, at least. Overall this week our theme is movement. This game has a fairly large amount of movement options, and you have to understand how to maximize them in order to keep yourself out of trouble, more so than anything else. Very few characters are lacking in movement options. They can be linear, but they don't tend to be too static. Even Potemkin, who has basically one meaningful move, no, two technically. Potemkin is the slowest character in the game and has basically two movement options. Kai is similarly linear. He has a lot of movement options, but you can usually tell what they're going to be. However, we're seeing here the demonstration of Sin, who has functionally the best backdash in the game. Important for getting out of a bunch of stuff and getting to eat. And a vault, which is more controllable than you'd initially think from seeing it, and is good for getting out of a ton of other stuff. It's not specifically invincible, but it's really easy to jump out of things with Sin's vault. When he does have anything else he has to use, his super moves are really effective also for getting him to a position he wants to be in, even if they tend to be kind of punishable. He can backdash out of the majority of counterattacks in this game, in fact. This also means that he doesn't really have to keep up pressure, which is good because he's not particularly good at it. And having the option of backdashing out of stuff or vaulting can keep the opponent really confused. Once you start using those moves, it's even harder to tell when Sin is going for the overhead you see there, making it a strangely stronger pressure tool, purely because Sin chooses to move more. This isn't to say that you should spend most of your time trying to move around, but it is a decent thing to spend a lot of time learning. If you've gotten to the point in a match where you don't know what else to do when you can't figure out any buttons to hit to solve your problem, jump, backdash, instant air dash, anything that involves you getting out of the way, and you might be surprised how often you succeed at that effort to get out of the way. This is also particularly important for Jack. Oh, as you've seen there, she can actually backdash and then neutral jump out of Kai's grinder if the setup isn't perfect. And if the setup is perfect, well, most likely she'll just block it. Jacko needs to spend a lot of time making sure that she is getting out of the way of moves so that it's harder to knock out her minions. So it's actually more important for Jacko to learn which moves she can escape after doing rather than which form of pressure she can actually use after them. Most of her moves are not safe enough in terms of her ability to hit her next move to make it worth it. However, she does have a lot of moves that hit at confusing ranges so that the opponent doesn't know which button to use to punish her, but they know which button to use if she pushes forward. Simple solution, don't push forward, get out of the way. even more useful is that because of the defensive nature of playing versus Jao and the fact that the player must put out a lot of buttons in order to deal with her minions and her houses, it's very often the case that once Jacko has managed to get out of the way of something, she can immediately do her longest range Elysian driver because the opponent will not only not be expecting it and probably be blocking, or just have done a move and whiffed it. The way that the move recovers when they do it synergizes well with her minions. She can do this move functionally from the air, but it's not a very good idea most of the time. On the other hand, she doesn't normally care. Once she's caught enough real estate on the screen, literally, you can whiff punish with Elysian Driver approximately the same way as most command grab characters in other games. Looking for the moment where your opponent is trying to destroy houses. The houses are right in front of them. They are thinking it's time to push out a button to get rid of this house. Just run up or walk up and squash them into the bell.
Get up to burn! Stand with the
Remember that once Jacko does put you in that sort of situation, she normally has to be close enough to you that you can just burst in neutral. You may get a lot of meter if you land it, and at worst, you didn't really lose anything. She doesn't have a lot of combos that you would otherwise need to burst out of, so you might as well use the burst to get out of that sort of pressure. However, using a lot of movement in this game requires a level of fearlessness that's hard to get to in fighting games. We're used to the idea of defense as blocking or of hitting more buttons so the opponent doesn't get to hit you first. It's harder to get yourself to just react to being in a defensive situation by specifically taking no other action than jumping straight up, jumping right over, instant air dash, vault, because those things are clearly things that the opponent could hit if they hit the right button. What is often not clear is that the right button is not usually anything they like. It can be something quite complicated. A large part of the skill of fighting games is that once you get cornered, figuring out the right moment to jump out of the corner without doing anything. You're not hitting any buttons, you're just blocking until you jump, rather than blocking until you hit a button. Because like, an opponent who is focused on pressuring you, unless they are a character who is good at air pressure, is also not generally focused on making sure to anti-air you. In certain games this is easier to do, but for the most part you can just jump, especially in Guilty Gear. This is because, especially if you use your green block, the faultless defense in the game, your opponent is often pushed back to a space where a scramble has started, so you both want to do something. But if they hit a button and you jump, most of the time you will actually escape. Most longer buttons in Guilty Gear tend to go directly in front and have very little high hitbox. So shifting out of the way is relatively easy. Slayer and Milia, and to some extent Venom, are the main characters for whom this is generally not as true, but even against them, depending on where you got pushed to and where they got pushed to, you can just jump out. And at worst, the act of trying to jump out is more likely to cause your opponent to rethink their strategy long enough for you to get some of your other defenses going. Above all else though, all three of those characters I mentioned, well, maybe not Venom, most of the characters I mentioned don't do so well once they are put back into the corner by you jumping over their head. So they must pause their pressure long enough to be sure that they can land whatever anti-air will trap you. And often this is a problem. It's just giving them more to think about, because an opponent who is just blocking in front of them is basically just a target. Green block helps, but it's mostly you're just a target until something changes. But you can see demonstrated there that you'd think that Slayer's crouch, that his basic bat aura, let's call it bat aura, you'd think that his bat aura would actually hit you when you jump, but it generally doesn't. There is a lot of Slayer stuff you can jump out of, simply because it looks as if it will work, and it doesn't. And you have so many options for directions once you're in the air, that Slayer is the one without the option set at that point. Also, since you're generally not hitting an actual attack, the way that the counter system works in almost all fighting games is if you just do a relatively a not dangerous jump. You're not trying to do anything offensive. You don't actually get counter hit, and a lot of moves depend on you getting counter hit in order to do either big damage or stagger you long enough to go into longer combos. So if you are willing to take the damage at all, which is generally true if you're willing to press buttons, for example, You should consider whether or not your opponent's big damage can be even done if you don't hit any buttons. Get hit, but don't get hit by actually trying to do something and getting counter hit. This is also the basis of the reason why one can neutral jump against Slayer in a lot of situations that otherwise would be dangerous to do against other characters. And because you can neutral jump and then air dash, you can change your position relative to him rather than waiting for something to happen to you. Slayer pressure, therefore, is based on making the opponent move into positions where Slayer can do something, using his other main options. He does have aerial strikes at a close range, but when he is far out and attempting to launch an attack from far out, it is not as likely that he'll actually manage to hit you. Slayer benefits therefore from waiting a bit more and generally hitting very long buttons in neutral, based on his feeling of where the opponent is going to flow to, preventing himself from having to deal with the movement as a defense. Watching them carefully allows him to recognize which buttons he generally needs to hit, and which buttons his opponent is going to rely on to counterattack him when he does. Because at the end of the day, if you do just keep on trying to hit with Slayer and your opponent only dodges, eventually you will come out on top simply because it's likely, given Slayer's damage, that you'll win out. But you should still beware of people who are too in tune with your defensive play. Because Slayers of that type will figure out how to get in on you without actually doing that. The range is not so much a thing that they care about. And he's a very hard character to consistently outdistance. However, once you have the life lead, it's relatively easy to dodge Slayer for long periods of time and with punish his bigger attacks. Understanding where to move to with punish Slayer is probably one of the most important parts of the matchup for beginners, because he is such a hard character to get off you once he manages to force you to block without invincible moves. He has a very good range at which easy counterattacks are not available, and can then just hit more stuff. So keep your eyes open for your whiff punish opportunities and try to make sure that you're standing in places or that you force his block to put you in those places where you can get them. However, you should note that generally Slayer is not a character who pushes you to positions that are not advantageous to himself. So your defensive game has to be fairly on point. Or you have to be willing to, as I said, just move out of the way rather than trying to actually block his stuff. He can't really be considered rush down. It's rather that he has a lot of strength in neutral because of being a short-range character whose moves are slightly faster than other characters. He gets to hold his position very well. This is precisely the reason why it is difficult to play Slayer against Kai, for example. Kai really can just put up Grinder, move out of the way of a ton of stuff, and then Slayer have very few basic options. Once the Grinder is out on the ground, even with Kai just doing the simplest of things, Kai gets to dash for free and get ready for the Whiff Punish. Once he's at the right range, Slayer has no real options but to proceed forward, because if he does not, he will end up facing heavy Grinder pressure. And he can't simply block in front of it because Kai's standing just as good. Well, good if you do general things, because that's what the Grinder functionally is. He's just putting up yet another one. You don't get to go, okay, I've been knocked away by the dust, so now I'm fine, because he has put up another one with the dust. Even if he whips it, as just demonstrated, he still gets to keep it. And Slayer's moves do not generally reach after that. Once put into that lock space, there's very little he can do directly other than use his invincible approaches, which Kai is more than equipped to deal with on reaction. One of the hardest parts of this matchup between these two is once they get two full screen against each other, they both have a relatively large advantage in one way or another. Combining their meters to get through things is generally the safest way to do anything. Use your burst, and at the same time use your Roman cancels and everything else, because it shifts the situation faster than trying to actually get in. And this goes for them both. For example, Jacko's minions don't actually get through blitz attacks. So if Sin absolutely needs to move forward and sees Jacko incoming, he can just blitz almost all the time. If she's coming with an army of minions behind her, still no problem. But this is mostly dependent on being at a long range to begin with. combine this with the burst gauge when it is available, and Jacko actually can't do that much against Sin until her minions get back. So you see her meter, in this case her special ability, is recharged and used for that purpose. But she gets clipped by the burst, loses the minion wave, and has to start over. But there we see her own use of Roman Cancel to change the situation so that Sin is behind and has to defend from all this. Sin in turn has to use up a ton of meter on defense and blitzing out and similar things. But this match is just the same basics as before. Movement. Since Kai has so many direct forward attacks, he's not very good at keeping Sin from going into the air, in any of the ways that Sin might choose to do so. Sin's options in neutral therefore get to stay basically the same, whereas Kai's are the ones that end up getting restricted. Kai therefore has to spend a lot more time running in to bap his son over the head. Once he is cornered, Sin is a little bit more vulnerable, but as you've just seen, with a little spacing skill, you can get through Grinder, get through attacks. You just have to be paying enough attention to where Kai put things and where Kai moved to. And this is normally difficult because keeping track of both of those at the same time is hard, but not because the execution to do it is particularly hard once you have kept it in mind or been able to observe it in time. From that perspective, it can initially be relatively just directly fun, because you are trying to run a gauntlet through all of Kai's potential traps and obstacles. It's just that Sin does this by jumping around the place, like any hyperactive child. This is very much the father-son, you can't catch me, I'm not going to bed experience. On top of all that, Kai opens himself up very heavily to Sin's counterattacks, specifically in the form of Ride the Lightning when Kai jumps into the air, because he is not good at getting away from it. Fortunately, as you can see, once Kai manages to get Sin into the corner early in the match before anyone has meter, he at least has enough advantage to get the life lead. And Sin must then focus on the number of different attack vectors he has. And basically guess, to be honest. he's not likely to get a chance to get enough meter unless Kai makes a mistake. And therefore using it there is a risk, because if Kai can put him back in the corner now, there's no way back out until he gets more meter. But good neutral play will prevent you from ever getting put back in the corner. And he didn't have to block it, so... Of course, doing right the lightning on reaction to Kai jumping is much more difficult than it sounds. As you see demonstrated there, it's actually generally safer for Sin to use the meter as soon as he's put into that situation for the blitz than to ever bother with the faultless defense, because there's just not going to be enough of it. There are too many hits, and it drains the meter too quickly. In the end, it runs out. This is actually true for nearly any character. The difference being that many more characters have upward attacks that are more likely to catch Jao moving around over your head to reposition herself while she sets up the minion wave. Sin does not have as many of these upward attacks that he can rely on in those situations, and therefore needs to use his burst and meter to do the blitz, and he tends to be further away from Jao in the first place. Fortunately, he also doesn't need to worry about this until he gets to about the space of half screen with minions behind Jao. But this situation as example, is very important for it. However, with full meter, you can afford a little bit of stuff. You see there that Sin manages to take advantage of the movement to get through. Not necessarily to land an attack, but to reset the situation so that he's no longer stuck in the corner and not waiting on the minion wave to arrive. So now that both our players have basically the entirety of an idea of how to play this matchup, what you're going to see now is a bunch of adaptations that are not necessarily specific to understanding matchup, but rather understanding each other. Sometimes when you feel as if you're not managing to get any better or aren't playing a character correctly, you should check whether or not this is a breed because the way you choose to play the game doesn't suit that character in that particular matchup. For example, our Kai tends to move forward at spaces that would generally get him in trouble because of the way that Sin is moving. If he gets stuck at full screen, it's very unlikely that he'll get in without Sin taking him by surprise or getting some damage off. Similarly, our Sin player generally defends for much longer than most Sin need to, and will be willing to stay in situations longer, giving Kai the chance to get longer attacks off. Since these two players know these two things about each other rather well, you'll find that Sin in this matchup will zone even though Kai has options to get around the zoning or could counter zone or at least try. And Kai will pressure more than would naturally work on most Sin. But the core parts of the matchup remain the same. Because these styles don't have direct disadvantages, they're always trade-offs. Kai takes more risks in neutral and sometimes they pay off based on timing or twitchiness. And Sin defends longer, leading to Kai having to use moves that would otherwise be safe in situations and spaces where they can be forced to be either unsafe or forced to be post-hit mix-ups. How much movement you use can definitely be based on how often your opponent moves or how often your opponent attacks a particular space. If they are waiting for you and trying to keep control of a particular situation, it's less likely that you actually need to do this. So movement is beaten by readiness, but often wins over pressure, at least in this game. You'll note, for example, that Sin has a lot of attacks that cross up relatively well. Compared to a lot of other characters in this game, he has really good air attacks if you are choosing precisely what you're going to do in midair. Most people don't have the same options. They have a particular one that helps them against a particular character and don't overthink it too much. Sin has a lot of options. They just have to all be decided fairly heavily at times when other characters don't have to think about it.
基本ができてない。それはいい。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワン、やっちまえ。来たぜ。耐えてみたまえ。あくびを。
As demonstrated here, Slayer's tendency to put you at spaces that are once again advantageous to himself means that you have to be careful about how you try to get out of his pressure, let's call it pressure. Because it's easy to get the impression that because you have blocked, it is now your turn. But using conventional moves in that situation is usually not the way to go, because Slayer has placed you at that space for a reason. It happens automatically based on the design of the character, actually. Generally, therefore, what you want is a move that does not seem like a good idea overall. Usually one that won't hit. Or you want to just backdash out, because again, once you have been hit by certain Slayer stuff and backdash, even if he does hit you, it's not usually too much to your detriment anymore. But consistently counterattacking is what he's basically counting on you to do, so that he can get damage from fishing for the counter hit. The other option, obviously, depending on the range of your character's attacks from their neutral jump, is to just jump straight up. This can be difficult at first because our general instinct is end of opponent block string, my turn, hit button. It is your turn, but it's not a button you're supposed to hit. Patience from Jackal allowed the trap to finally be sprung. And without the blitz, Finn was unable to get out. Jackal's aerial minions are very capable of shutting down Sin's aerial escapes, which is why the blitz becomes necessary. If you have a character who uses a lot of aerial mobility and does not have a grounded, invincible, or semi-invincible way to move forward, well, you'll just have to use the universal one. The main counter to movement options like this in this game is just throws. If you get too close to your opponent, throwing is one of their fastest and most effective overall options. Scrambles where two players have decided to do a lot of movement and gotten very close to each other are decided by throws more often than anything else, because if you were not aware, throws in this game are literally only one frame. It's not that you can't tech them, but the situation in which throwing becomes a good idea is when you can't hit anything else because anything else you hit is too slow. There's not a lot of time spent next to each other in this game, but movement-based scrambles tend to lead to a lot of it. In order to avoid whiff punishes, we often end up in those spaces where we want to take an action, and hitting just punch, while effective, is obviously blockable. Therefore, it helps be very attached to the idea of, I am close, I have gotten close through some random situation. Let me grab my opponent with my heavy button. If it's a true scramble, chances are that they couldn't possibly have hit anything else in time to get away from you doing it themselves. But unlike other games where the throw is a mix-up that comes from you being close, most moves in this game have enough pushback or can be forced to have enough pushback, that this is not where that normally comes up. It's not that throwing is hard when you do it intentionally, but rather that it's most effective when it wasn't intentional at the time you started it. Well, not the throw, the thing that led to the throw. If you find yourself intending to land throws on people, you should probably be playing Jam. Command throws obviously do not count, and Potemkin is excused. As noted, if you really want to stop Slayer, you have to dash out of his stuff. He is not going to ever, under normal circumstances, be in a position where you hitting a button in response to the end of his block string is a good idea. Get out of the way, set up a whiff punish, rethink your situation, and then go back in. Because he has to get back to you somehow. He is not mobile enough as a character that when he is at the end of a string and you backdash away, that he can delay and then still get in for free. Even his dash, while it is a perfectly good tool given to him for that purpose, namely that you can't tell how far he's going to dash, depending on your character, you don't even care.
しく考えない能力って実は数学的に考えてもすごいんだよ。
心を精錬することだ。はい、勝ちだ。ストレート。基本ができてない。ソルは一体何を教えていたんだ。もっともその潜在の逆をまずスレイヤー。さあ楽しもうぜ。
君のね、
恨みっこなしだ。デュエル1、やっちまえ。
破壊力マジスマンドだ。このアンブスレーザー。
One other good option, if you don't think that back dashing is a good option for yourself, is to either attempt a low profile or do a move that pulls back your hurt box when you start it in order to get around Slayer's attacks. For Jackal, this is mostly her standing dust, and Let's call it ball and chain for now. Now, these moves do not both beat the same thing, so Slayer does not just get beat up by it. But it is useful enough in certain situations that if you can see where the Slayer's strings are going and recognize the range you're at, you know which button to hit. Like nearly all responses in fighting games, once you have gotten a large enough repertoire of things you use for your response, in this case, neutral jump to get away from the lows, combined with the stand in dust when you expect to be replenishing something, and similar strikes, your opponent no longer can use their basic canned mix-ups to push you around. Kai is actually using the same principle, the difference being that since Kai does not have as many good aerial attacks as Jack-O, but has not necessarily a better backdash, but has no penalty for backdashing, whereas Jack-O will eventually end up leaving her houses exposed. Kai uses the same concept, but with a different option. Either sticking out a button and going for the punish, or actually going for the backdash so that he can punish any forward movement from Slayer, while setting up his own space. If he gets free space, then obviously he can put up grinders and hit other things of that type. Slayer is then forced to play neutral in a way that requires him to give up a lot of his pressure even when he actually gets close enough to land it. Because it stops being a good idea to actually keep doing it. This allows Kai to go back to his regular game, throwing fireballs, sliding, just long pulse in neutral. All of those things become available to him again because Slayer slows down on his own tendency to hit stuff in neutral by necessity. But the player should generally make sure that they do not get into the habit of expecting one half of the situation solution to continually work. There's really no reason why your opponent ever has to let you do that. If you don't learn to swap between two mindsets, in most matches you will get downloaded and defeated. You don't really have to be random, but find some system for yourself, some code for yourself that tells you when to switch mindset that your opponent isn't triggering. If your opponent is the one triggering your mindset switches, they will start to recognize your tells over time and feel much more comfortable in the match, even when they should be concerned. They could have lower health than you and still feel confident enough to finish you off because they think it will work. So it helps to build up some little thing in your head that tells you which way you should be playing. Be it the timer changing, be it your own meter changing, be it your opponent's meter changing. Find something that is in front of you on the screen that your opponent is not likely to be able to easily track in the same timings to decide whether or not you're being the person who tries to punish or the person who tries to backdash. This is also helpful for your own meter watching. If you're using your meter or your opponent's meter as some form of trigger for your own behavior, then obviously you have to be paying at least some attention to it. This is relatively easy to do once you've gotten used to blocking for longer periods, because there's nothing else to do but hold down back while you're blocking. You just hold down back and look at someplace else on the screen for a moment. Until you reach an opponent who has very strong quick mix-ups, it's probably not going to be a problem.
当にくつろいでくれたまえ。
スレイヤー勝ちだ。ストレート。
若さが光る戦いは見る者を興奮させるが、互いの理念がまみえる戦いは人を感動させる。君に歴史があるのならいい戦いになったはずなのだ。
君のね。
恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやったそこ
理論値通りとはいかないものね。
ジャックを勝ちだ。デュエル2全部出してよな。
勝負でした。
Understanding Jack O's defensive play is a lot more about understanding your opponent's feelings when under pressure than anything else. The key is to make your opponent feel pressured and then just not continue that pressure. To make them nervous in some way, while not overall changing the way that it feels to play. So in general, keep that in mind when you are trying to play Jack O, and keep in mind from your own side when you're going up against her that hesitating too much because she keeps on attempting to pressure you is an easy way to cause yourself problems.
文武両道彩色権利、何をやってますげってのは勝つ喜びより負ける楽観の方が大きそうだ。メンゴ
up to burn! Stand with the fight!
恨みっこなしだデュエルワンやっちまえ
One very important thing to understand is that the guessing part of fighting games happens at various levels, and it's knowing which level your guessing needs to happen at that lets you know how far you developed your character. For example, in this case, Kai is no longer guessing on wake up or guessing in order to get in. Kai is guessing at the end of a Slayer block string. Sometimes we guess in neutral. In fact, we often guess in neutral. That's kind of how Footsies tends to work, for many games anyway. With two players of equal skill, for the most part, they are guessing in neutral as well. With optimal play, the aim is to get to a situation that is obviously advantageous to you, where no matter what your opponent guesses, they don't get to do any damage. And if they guess wrong, you still get an advantage and stay in neutral if they guess right. That's mostly what this is. How can I stay in a situation where my opponent's options to my approach are guess right and stay in neutral, or guess wrong and take damage? There being the classic example.
Get up to rock! Get up to burn!
恨みっこなしだデュエルワンやっちまえ
激しく
とってもまだスレイヤー VS アクセルさあ楽しもうぜ
Get up to rock, get up to burn, stand with the
恨みっこなしだ
never feel your desire.
ワンやっちまえ
すでにあくびが出る。やるな、やるな。あくびが出る。あくびが出る。早く見たまえ。おう。やるな。あくび。早く見たまえ。早く見たまえ。高くついたがいい事情だったね。
デュエル2全部出し切れよな
おう。やるな。
アクセル勝ちだ俺もイギリス人として紳士学は学んだけどさ勝負まで譲ることはないんだぜ
Well, we all know this matchup. We've been talking about it for some weeks now. There's nothing specific about it that needs to change because of the styles of the two players, though. After all, they are both very quintessentially Kai and Ino, and therefore will tend to just play the characters as they were more or less designed. You may see some adaptation over time, but when players know each other this well, and when the matchup is not necessarily defined but has clear points of advantage and disadvantage to either character, there's always some emergent mix-ups, but obviously Kai can't just never get hit by standing dust from Ino. It's functionally impossible for many reasons. Ino has too many other options that are technically worse if Kai basically refuses to ever block low. Similarly, Kai's movement and choices in the neutral aren't going to change just because Ino has different ways around them. You can't spend all of your time refusing to do Greed Sever because it might be punished. Nor does the chance of it not working go up just because your opponent knows you will do it. Because the thing that makes it work is not about whether or not your opponent understands it, but simply a part of the mix-ups of the game. You should be careful to figure out from anyone who plays the character that you are going up against whether or not they actually know how to block or defend whatever it is you're doing and are just having physical execution trouble with it, or maybe mindset problems with it. Or if it is that they don't know or don't think there is a way, in which case you both benefit from them trying to find that way and you continuing to use it because it lets you win and eventually forces them to come up with something that then you can learn. Another match that we know relatively well, based on the fact that Ino can actually keep up with Axel in range, because whenever Axel sticks out anything, he has a chance of encountering one of Ino's moves. She's not as good at getting in on him, but she doesn't tend to need to as much. In fact, attempting to do so is probably a good way to lose because Axel's moves cover all of the space that Ino needs to move through with very little problem. She has to use extremely precise movement to do this, so it's easier to just throw out the note, which she does not deal with as easily, and then use that to cover her approach. Once she is in, she tends to be much more effective against him. But once she gets pushed out, Axel can't actually be sure that he will reach her without getting hit himself. This gives her a relatively large space to throw out the note without worrying about moving toward him. From there, it's generally up to the player's style and perception of their opponent to decide how exactly they're going to get to him. Whether or not they're going to go straight in and force him to block and hope their opponent twitches, or functionally walk forward and attempt to clip him with the riff instead, or even just go under like that. But all she cares about is getting back into the footsie space where she has at least a slight advantage due to the relatively slower normals Axel has. Axel in turn, when he realizes I can't keep you out, I failed at that, should generally just backdash. It's not the best of options, but recreating the space where Ino must therefore decide if she's doing it again, especially if he doesn't move after it immediately, her best response isn't even all that good. But as you can see, unfortunately for her, raw approaches tend to be very, very dangerous for her. Ino's moves are not themselves so fast that Axel won't have a good chance of reacting. Even if she reaches the ground, she can't necessarily launch another attack in time to actually clip him before he can get out of the way, and even if she did, he has counters.
Get up to rock, get up to burn, stand with the pride, ever feel your desire.
恨みっこなしだデュエルワンやっぱ
俺もイギリス
スレイヤー VS イノ。さあ楽しもうぜ。
Get up to rock, get up to burn.
恨みこなしたデュエル1いや
年はとっても
イノ VS アクセル。さあ楽しもうぜ。恨みこなしたデュエル1やっちまえ。やって
Once Ino starts throwing the note, Axel learns quickly that you can't get away from every note. Because she can, as just demonstrated, send the note over his head and still have it explode on his head. It's a little bit hard on the execution, but Axel can't do much about it while she's doing this. So, until he comes up with something that reaches, because as you will note, the Rashosen does not actually reach the entire screen. While zoning is not really an option for Ino in the long term, the idea that Axel can deal with her just because he's far away is not true. Because in order to wait for the note to make sure that you got away from it, or to prepare the move that would easily push at Ino even though she's far away, he has to give up a lot of time that she can then use for other options that she was being held off from by all the buttons he would have been able to hit on reaction. In short, preparing to make sure that Ino can't zone Axel prevents Axel from playing his keep out game. It's good to have this option in a lot of games and a lot of matchups. To go back to zoning your opponent when they try to zone you out, just so they have to stop, and therefore you can actually get in. Certain characters have this ability for pretty much that purpose and no other. They're not intended to actually zone very well, but they have a projectile mostly to make other people who want to keep them out annoyed. Ino is exactly that sort of character. Her aim is to make you react to a bunch of things, and if those things happen to be notes flying at your feet, then you just have to deal with that. Breaking down games that freeform state of I want to do this because I'm here, or this other thing because I'm here, is important for moving beyond a certain point. So, for example, what are Sin's options in the corner against Ino like this? Well, because Ino's attacks generally go straight out in front of her, Sin can actually vault out of her stuff basically on wake up as soon as he wants, because she won't actually be able to do something every time. However, at least some of the time she will hit him. That's just how that works. If the Sin player therefore becomes discouraged because they get hit sometimes, they're going to hand over a lot of control of the match and damage to Ino simply because they're worried about getting hit. Case in point, it would probably have been possible to get out of that with just Wake Up Vault. But if one is concerned that the opponent has a plan specifically to beat your option, then it becomes scary to use your option. Even if you had a different one, and they probably couldn't have covered both, It is often that defensive players feel as if their opponent has their number, that their opponent can do the thing that they feel as if they can't do. Be ready for everything. Psychologically, there's some imposter syndrome involved there. Feeling that you can't possibly do everything, but for some reason your opponent can cover everything. This leads to a lack of experimentation with some characters, and lacking their options then leads to you feeling frustrated or crippled while playing them. But once you learn the options you have, it's a lot easier to feel safe using them, and you tend to learn more about what happens after you use them. Until you get to that point, it is always going to feel as if there's not much reward or benefit to using the option, because the only things you'll remember is occasionally it worked and helped a little bit, but you immediately mentally go back into the same situation because it turns into a scramble, and you weren't ready for the scramble, so you often lose it. It's not easy to remember that the match went better, because the match didn't necessarily go better. Similarly, when your opponent does adapt, if you got too caught up in doing the one thing because you were focused on thinking about what happens when you get it right, it may feel as if it doesn't work because your opponent has guessed right every time. But they didn't guess right every time because they're prepared, they guessed right because your mental state shifted and made you predictable. It's therefore very important to try to be as free-form as you can in these situations. The more you can do for yourself in those situations without feeling afraid of failing, the more likely you are to learn more options for your character and become more invested in those options as they become more and more, as the payoff of throwing them gets larger and larger. For example, you can see here how Sin's close range options boil down to basically two things against Axel. Move forward with the strike, or just hit the standing slash, if he's close already. Similarly, if he's far out, it's basically whiff punishing with his overhead, or vaulting. Now, it's not as if every Axel won't be able to respond at all to these things, but Sin's options don't change just because Axel could respond to them. Ah, slow down netcode. This is, however, a good time to point out the risk meter in this game. I mention it probably once a week. The meter under the health bar that slowly turns pink while you block is not really a guard break meter per se, because it serves a separate function. The higher that meter is, the more damage you will usually take from the next attack that actually connects. Therefore, it is actually in your best interest to just make your opponent block for a long time. Characters who are good at this are Slayer, Jam, and Sin, but how much the bar goes up is not directly related to how much damage the move would have done. There's a similar feeling when on basic defense against Ino as there is when on offense against Ino. Sin has some very strong offensive options against Ino, basically just hitting his heavy slash in neutral. Because of the extreme range of the move, and the fact that none of her stuff really goes to it that well, she has to open herself up to Beak Driver in order to avoid getting hit by that move. But how do you know which one to hit? There's no way to know. And there's simply no way for your opponent to know which of their options they should use either. You can see the interaction play out quite a lot here. But it isn't really just guessing. It's understanding of your opponent and setting up your own emotional state so that your opponent can't read it. Different types of player have different reactions after certain amounts of time, which is what we have called status effects when it comes to Street Fighter. Knowing what status effect you can put on your opponent helps a lot. So, does Ino become more twitchy when under pressure, or does she become more defensive under pressure? This informs the rate at which you should use one move or the other. Not necessarily specifically which move will work, but you can tilt your perspective of which one should happen. You should be doing one more often because of it, but you should still randomly do the other occasionally. More meter and other unconventional options get mixed in there, and going with your gut instinct fixes the rest. Trying to figure out your opponent too much only works if they can be figured out. And sometimes it's just not possible to do that well enough. As your options become more and more familiar to you, it becomes more and more possible for you to do things after them, to convert off scrambles. And converting off scrambles with correct spacing is a good way to push the limits of your character. It's very well to learn combos, but learning combos you can do out of strange situations is actually more likely to give you benefit. A long combo that you cannot land or never get the situation for is not going to save you when you've spent a whole match dropping small ones because you didn't expect the situation to actually work. It's therefore very helpful to keep at least 2 options for every main situation in the game in mind. Main situations in most games are your wake up, where most people actually know their multiple options, they're usually 2 to 3. Trapped in the corner but not under direct pressure, again, mostly just 2 or 3. And standing against a particular character in neutral, which is usually the most complex part. You spend a lot of time learning how to deal with certain opposing characters in neutral because it's slightly different for each one, and remembering it all can be a little off-putting for some people. Especially when you occasionally forget for a little while, end up facing an opponent who does one thing all the time, and you can't remember why the one you use normally is the good idea. For example, it's actually relatively hard to hit this particular Eno with the Beat Driver on its own. If it's the only other thing you ever do, chances are she will block or move through all of them. You could, however, meet another Eno against whom that is the best attack you have in neutral, and every time you try to stand Heavy Slash, you get beat out by something and cannot remember why stand Heavy Slash was ever a good idea. But you must still keep both of your options in mind, just so that you can figure out which of those 2 options is the one you need against a particular opponent. You can also be sure that relatively, people are more likely to press on you when one of your options for response is relatively difficult execution. For example, Sin's response to Eno at very close range is either the scramble of the Heavy Slash throw style or to do Hawk Baker, both of which are a little bit difficult because sometimes you have to walk forward a slight amount for the throw, And Hot Baker is just harder to execute under pressure than most things. An opponent, therefore, who knows that, well, the throw is easier, so you're more likely to go for that, will do the thing that you need to beat with Hawk Baker so that they have that situation. Eventually frustrating you into trying Hawk Baker and potentially still failing and losing. Players may not even realize that's what they're doing. They're just doing the thing that keeps on working and they keep on seeing counter hit. It's easy to give the opponent the impression that you don't know how to play when you are having execution trouble on your defensive option. But generally, you should never let yourself feel as if you don't have an option for a situation at all, or that your character has nothing they can do. There's almost always something they can do. It's just a question of how risky the something is. One example here is that the standing heavy slash that I've been mentioning is actually a really good anti-air against Ino forcing. But until you recognize that fact, you're not likely to hit it. And that will let Ino get free air pressure, get close to you, and set up a whole bunch of situations you dislike. Similarly, feeling comfortable enough to do this requires that you feel that you understand when Ino will try to attack from the air in the first place. If you don't feel you understand that, then you're not likely to get very far in terms of using that button for anything. But all you really want is to catch the Ino player with it basically once. So for example here, while it might seem that you can't hit this on wake up, depending on which way Ino comes down or from you, you can totally hit it on wake up. Depending on where Ino is standing, you can always hit it on wake up. But it doesn't feel like that. It's not a button that you would feel you can get away with. And it's because that feeling is robbing you of your options that you end up feeling like you can't do anything at all. But Ino has to get really close to Sin before waking up with his stand heavy slash is actually a bad idea outright. All of the things that she can do to beat it lose so terribly to him just blocking that it becomes a problem.
もう少し上手になってね。そうしたらまた相手してあげる。
Well, going with our usual give or take 15 minutes approach to stream, and since people have had various issues tonight with actually managing to stay in, we'll probably be drifting off a little earlier than usual. And as this is a matchup that you've heard me talk about quite enough, you're not likely to get much more audio tonight. As always, stop by tomorrow for our Street Fighter content. We will obviously be looking at changes that may have come up as a result of the patch, specifically looking at Rashid Bot, because that is likely to have some serious shifts. Some possible stuff for Sakura and Sakura Bot, which may also come up. You know how it goes. It's relatively easy to see through the patch notes what has most likely changed and which bots need to be looked at, so we are likely looking at them either tomorrow or Friday. Or both. Thursday, we should be having Dragon Ball Fighters content. Our Kame House Beginner Lounge has basically the same format as this, US East Coast. Loser stays on, talking about and exploring matchups. And of course, if your main focus is Guilty Gear, we'll be back next week, same time. Alright then, and with that display, we'll close out our stream for the night. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And join us again whenever you have interest in any of our content. This is Meridian for 2_MK. Good night.